The Good Old Grateful Deadcast, the official podcast of the Grateful Dead. I'm Rich Mahan with Jesse Jarnow, exploring the music and legacy of the Grateful Dead for the committed and the curious. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Deadheads, welcome to Season 9 of the Good Old Grateful Deadcast. I'm your co-host, Rich Mahan. Thank you very much for tuning in. We are happy to be back here in the middle of Season 9, and we continue our deep dive into the Grateful Dead's 1974 studio album, From the Mars Hotel. This episode, we spend a night on the town with Loose Lucy, their mercurial track that closes Side 1. It is the 50th anniversary of the Grateful Dead's From the Mars Hotel, and to celebrate this, Rhino has a grand 50th anniversary release in the works. It includes the original album remastered, some really cool early demos of songs from the album, and a previously unreleased live show that's absolutely fantastic. The Grateful Dead played the University of Nevada, Reno on May 12, 1974, and this was the first roadshow for the infamous Wall of Sound, which debuted weeks earlier at home in San Francisco on March 23rd at the Cow Palace. This audio was cleaned up and remastered by Grammy Award-winning engineer David Glasser with Plangent Process's tape restoration and speed correction, and was produced for release by David Lemieux. All of the aforementioned are available as a 3-CD set as well as digitally. There's a standard black vinyl, a Dead.net exclusive custom vinyl, and a very cool heliotropic vinyl version you have to see to believe. Its graphics animate when you spin it on your turntable. More info and orders are happening now at Dead.net. Head on over to Dead.net/Deadcast and check out all of our past episodes, including the complete seasons 1 through 8, and you can link from there to your favorite podcasting platform so you can listen how and where you like to listen. Please help this podcast by subscribing, sharing us with your friends on social media, hitting that like button, and leave us a review. Thank you very kindly. We do have transcripts for many of your favorite Deadcast episodes available for your reading pleasure. Check out Dead.net/Deadcast-index to see which episodes are available now. And hey now, folks, were any of you at any of the Wall of Sound shows in 1974? Well, leave us a recorded message of your story at stories.dead.net and tell us about your experiences with the Wall of Sound. We want to hear from you. We do use them in the Deadcast when we get something that fits just right, so record your Wall of Sound tour stories at stories.dead.net. Loose Lucy is a good time rocker that continues the Grateful Dead tradition of their songs that morphed in arrangement through the years. Odd time signature measures, extra measures, the band tweaked the song to fit their mood and their sets. Let's dive into the real nitty-gritty of this classic tune with our mutual friend, Jesse Jarnow.
Lucy is my delight. She come running at me all night.
The first side of From the Mars Hotel closed with what kids these days call a bop.
Round and round and round and round. Don't take much, get me on the ground.
Grateful Dead archivist and legacy manager David Lemieux.
Loose Lucy is a song it's a party song. I love it. I think it's a great song. It gets everybody up and dancing. And just this arrangement of it, the peppy, the 74 arrangement is so much fun. I just can't get enough of it.
Singing thank you for a real good time.
Loose Lucy is a song that would change over time, both its arrangement and, in a way, what it meant.
The lyric, thank you for a real good time, it's our lyric. It's the Deadheads lyric, thanking the band for a real good time. And here's the band singing it back to us, thanking us for a real good time.
For a real good time.
I mean, that's not what they're doing. They're thanking Loose Lucy for a real good time. But the way I interpreted it,
More than a half-century into the collective history of Grateful Dead music, a lot of pieces of their repertoire and lore have ended up with a bit more gravity and different meanings than they were almost certainly intended. That's kind of the story of Loose Lucy that we're going to tell today, and by extension, from the Mars Hotel as a whole. But to get there, as we often do, we're going to reset slightly to try to get back to how Dead Freaks heard the Dead's music in 1974. In the early 1980s, Lee Ranaldo would co-found one of my all-time favorite groups, the game-changing Sonic Youth.
I can't see anything at all. All I see is me. That's clear enough. That's what's important. To see me.
But in the early 1970s, Lee was a serious long-haired Dead Freak. We talked with Lee about his experiences at the Watkins Glen Summer Jam last season, and we're stoked to welcome back Lee Ranaldo. He bought From the Mars Hotel immediately upon its release in June 1974.
I had no idea it was a real place. We sort of thought of it as like a hotel on the planet Mars. What I really remember focusing on was the album cover, which was so mysterious with that backward writing and all that stuff on it. And I just remember being kind of fascinated by the colorful, spacey look of both the front cover and that group shot on the back cover where they're all kind of like almost like cartoon characters or whatever. It seemed very modern for them somehow at the time, especially after Wake of the Flood, which had like an image that almost harked back to like old gravures or something like that. I loved Phil stepped up, and I really loved Unbroken Chain, and I thought that his two songs were wonderful.
Listening for the secret, searching for the sound. But I could only hear the preacher and the baying of his hounds.
U.S. blues in that moment in time, coming up on the bicentennial and all that stuff, it just had this very interesting quality to it, that song, you know. I think people were really psyched to hear that song because it seemed to speak to the moment we were living in somehow, in a political way that the Dead didn't usually venture into it, I guess.
I'm Uncle Sam. That's who I am. Been hiding out in a rock and roll band. Shake the hand that shook the hand of P.T. Barnum and Charlie Chan.
We'll reconnect with Lee's adventures as a young Dead Freak later this episode. Loose Lucy wasn't a heavy song. It had a pretty clearly conveyed message of fun. The kind of song that made it possible for Mars Hotel to soundtrack summer cross-country trips. Loose Lucy had a slightly different kind of contemporary political undercurrent, written a month or two after California ratified the Equal Rights Amendment in November 1972, and debuted the day after Oregon and Minnesota did the same. If the synthesizers make Unbroken Chain sound like 1974, but also the future, the lyrics make Loose Lucy sound like 1974, but also 1974. From The New Yorker, Nick Paumgarten.
The language of Loose Lucy is so sort of caught up in that biker culture, like beatnik culture. It seems like set in a certain time, in a certain point of view.
I think this is maybe the lyric Nick is thinking of.
She come running and we fall all night.
I mean, it's shocking to hear that come out of Jerry Garcia's mouth, too. It's for a guy that was sort of pretty picky about the things that he would say on stage. When Garcia sings about sex, which is pretty rare, there's something kind of sassy about it. That there's like an ironic distance or something that just doesn't bother me as much as we're doing it.
I got drunk coming home last night. Shadow in the alley tonight, all my lights.
Sort of back alley, dirtbag, druggy biker Grateful Dead, which I've always liked that whole vibe.
Deadcast hero Corey Arnold has a theory that I've never seen supported, but is plausible enough to float here. That Loose Lucy was written with the intention of giving it to the far raunchier Pigpen to sing. I can kind of hear it. From a groove point of view, Loose Lucy is another in a series of cartoon boogies that Garcia would begin to write in 1971 especially.
It has that ramshackle thing, sort of jalopy on square wheels, that I love about all of these songs. Ramble on Rose has it, Tennessee Jed has it, tons of them have it.
The reason for that lurch is this unassuming little bar of 7/8 mid-verse.
She come running and we fall all night. Round and round and round and round.
That little lurch has surely triggered raised eyebrows and probably a few off-mic discussions in any band that's ever tried to perform it. But the playful arrangement supported playful lyrics.
It's cheeky. I like it when the Dead is cheeky. It's an important part of all rock and roll bands.
Cross my heart and hope to die. I was just hanging out with the other guys singing, yeah, 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 yeah. Singing thank you for a real good time.
The scarcity of raunch came up in a conversation with Jerry Garcia, Blair Jackson, and David Gans in 1981, now in Conversations with the Dead, which we've linked to at dead.net/deadcast. Thanks, David. This is Blair's voice starting.
There is very little stuff about, kind of open sexuality.
Oh, I've never really been that attracted to songs of that sort, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, mostly because most of them have real dumb lyrics.
Loose Lucy is about the only one that...
Yeah, there's a few.
Hints at a raunchy side, sort of.
So it's Scarlet Begonias in a way.
Yeah, I can see that.
They Must Have Been the Roses is a weird sort of love song.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's others too. Oh, I think Candyman is pretty blatant.
Yeah, right.
Shit.
About
man.
what?
Candyman.
Come on, you pretty women, with your hair hanging down. Open up your window, 'cause the Candyman's in town.
One might point at Loose Lucy, the song, as being the product of the late sexual revolution, or, as the Coen brothers once put it, the new freedoms. But it might also just be a product of contemporary attitudes.
Do you like sex, Mr. Lebowski?
Sex.
Maybe, that many
Or
songs are-
love, or any of that, male-female stuff.
I think it's a measure of how Jerry Garcia and Robert Hunter thought about the Dead that sex showed up more in the songs that Jerry Garcia chose to sing with his side projects.
I'm going red, my tongue's getting tired. I'm up ahead, my mouth's getting dry. Let's spend the night together. I need you more than ever. Let's spend the night together now.
I've never thought about it one way or another. But I've had women livers, especially back in the 70s, and I haven't, and nobody's told me that for a long time, say that the stuff was
They've
like,
given up.
Men talking to men,
Yeah.
And
I think you can see that in
Yeah.
Hunter's writing a lot. This
Yeah,
is
definitely.
so much Old West.
Hunter's very much a masculine on that trip. He's like acting out. He's definitely more masculine of a person.
And it's not like there's not karmic payback in Loose Lucy either.
I got John coming home last night. Shadow in the alley tonight, all my lights.
Loose Lucy brings back the Lemieux thing. He's the same guy almost from Tennessee Jed. Things keep happening to this guy.
In Bob Sarlin's 1973 profile of Robert Hunter in his book Turn It Up, titled Invisible Song Poet, Sarlin paraphrases Hunter speaking about, as Sarlin puts it, a dead character who can be found in many of the songs on Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, their next album. This character is indeed a working man and an underdog, and is expressive of the group personality. Sarlin cites Dire Wolf and Cumberland Blues as versions of the character. I wouldn't say the characters in Tennessee Jed and Loose Lucy are continuations of that, but maybe share a universe with that character.
He's also kind of a rounder and a hapless ladies' man. This guy gets beat up all the time.
I imagine him as one of the not-quite innocents, always asking Mr. Natural for advice in R. Crumb comics, maybe friends with Flaky Funt.
Anyone who brags about having sex all night with someone is going to get two black eyes. It's going to get it upside the head. It's basically the idea.
Went back home.
song was introduced at a chipper bounce in early 1973, with much of the Jerry Garcia-Robert Hunter material that constituted Wake of the Flood. That was from RFK Stadium on June 9th, 1973, now on the Here Comes Sunshine box set. A few weeks later, the band slowed it down a bit for their July performances before recording it in the studio in August. I'm not really sure why, but for the duration of the year, it became a bit bluesier. Maybe they thought they needed a tune at that tempo to fit in with the album they were making.
Listen to the birds on the hot wire singing, yeah.
There was an unfinished studio take of Loose Lucy included on the Beyond Description box set. The song didn't make the album, but they kept playing it through their fall tours and into 1974. Loose Lucy wasn't on Jerry Garcia's original list for Mars Hotel either that we discussed last episode, but they recorded it anyway and now leaned into an even faster tempo. Maybe they got to the studio and decided they needed another up-tempo number. Brian Kehew is the engineer responsible for transferring the recent Angel Share outtakes.
I'm looking at 4/5 as the earliest date, but also 4/8 showed up. The copy tape of the master, the original takes, was made on 4/20. No joke intended. Many of these copy tapes were made on the same day, so I think that was a break point where they stopped and said, hey, we've kind of got what we need. Let's back up a lot of these master takes, and before we start doing overdubs, we'll make a safety copy of the tape in case something happens. And the sync reel, as it was with Money Money, was done on 4/27 to do options there.
As you may have noticed, there's not much of Loose Lucy on the Angel Share, yet the surviving tape is labeled Take 16.
It's evidence that they were treating unused tape as available tape. Unused, not used for the record, as you can have this, don't spend money on that, you can use one of our old tapes.
By 1975, when the Dead were taking a break from the road and weren't exactly flush with tour cash, the members were working on solo albums, and all those extra takes of Loose Lucy might seem less relevant.
Don't forget that in this time period, not the Beatles, not Hendrix, not Sinatra, no one had gone backwards into looking at outtakes. All that mattered was the master take and the released mix of it. They didn't even want a different mix of something. They wanted one version of a record that was essentially perfect.
As with the session tapes for Unbroken Chain, the original Loose Lucy recordings were probably nationalized into the greater pool of Grateful Dead tapes available for studio projects, which would require and shed a trail of reels for years to come.
I'm looking now at the Loose Lucy sync reel, which was done on 4/27 is the date of that one, or at least the date appears to be dated. And they have that, slide guitar left and right.
Played by Jerry Garcia, the slide part is a fun way to ornament the groove without overlapping with Garcia or Weir's other guitar parts. It's more color than flash. The ending is about as excitable as the slide part gets. From a guitar point of view, Loose Lucy is a cool way to hear Garcia and Weir build a groove together. Here's Garcia's core part. And here's Bob Weir's part, fitting around that. Keith Godchaux played Rhodes. Phil Lesh's bass line wasn't your typical Motown groove. They might not have had a second drummer in 1974. Bill Kreutzmann added a solid tambourine pulse underneath the whole song. Perhaps the most subtle colors in the final mix are a pair of Roland synthesizer parts, once again played by Keith Godchaux and Jerry Garcia, both overdubbed on April 29th. They both play the same notes, but with very different keyboard sounds. Here's Keith. And Jerry, sounding more like a secret room in the original Legend of Zelda. And together, this is from the outro.
They're not even that different. They're kind of related parts, like each guy took his stab at the idea, but they maybe liked both of them. It's fascinating. I do find that a lot of these tracks have Jerry on synthesizer. Not that Keith doesn't play. He definitely does. But we've never thought of Jerry as a synth wizard, but I'm sure he could get around on a normal keyboard, so a synthesizer is not much different in those days.
Garcia also did a second vocal tape on the sync reel. Here's the first vocal take they kept. We'll compare the ending to see what Garcia might have been focusing on.
Your style, but I ain't your type. Don't shake the tree when the fruit ain't ripe. Yeah, 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 yeah. Singing yeah, 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 yeah. Thank you for a real good time.
And the second take.
I like your smile, but I ain't your type. Don't shake the tree when the fruit ain't ripe. Yeah, 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 yeah. Singing yeah, 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 yeah. Singing yeah, 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 yeah. Singing thank you for a real good time.
If you guessed they used the second take to fill out Garcia's vocal for the ending, you were correct. The Dead had a production schedule to keep. Recording in April and mixing in May, they had to get it out by their June tour. While they were making noise in the studio, the head of their record company was starting to make noise on their behalf about upcoming projects. Please welcome back, from Grateful Dead and Round Records, mid-70s editions, Ron Rakow.
Everybody thinks everything in the Grateful Dead was decided and discussed and analyzed. That's not the way it was. It was a bunch of total fucking lunatics. Half of them stoned, half of the other half were drunk, and half of the other half were rigid.
Last episode, we discussed how their record company, Grateful Dead Records, had spawned a second record company, Round, co-owned by Jerry Garcia and Ron Rakow. In May 1974, just as the Dead were putting the finishing touches on From the Mars Hotel, it was time to roll Round into the world. A letter was dispatched to the Grateful Dead mailing list. Dear Gorilla, we're doing it, appearing in yet another manifestation. But by now, you should be expecting that.
This is my early systemizing the fans to do the work. This is the record company parallel to the Deadheads. The Deadheads were being run by Eileen Law.
In the 70s, Deadheads was the name of the band's newsletter.
We had our own separate mailing list. I was building something from the ground up. There was a lot of internal reluctance to participate.
Though they shared infrastructure, Round Records was a separate business from Grateful Dead Records. The mailing contained a 7-inch record with some new music, a sampler for Deadheads, it read. But while it was music from the Grateful Dead, it wasn't music by the Grateful Dead.
Turn on the bright lights. Turn on the bright lights. What a fool I have been.
And the other side of the first sampler for Deadheads featured music from a voice not heard on record since the Dark Star single.
Hammer and ripsaw, the waves keep a rising. Step up, tell us the name of your poison. I took a step forward and it fell out of my hat at the sign in the window saying take what you lack. I went to inquire just about how much pain was needed to purchase the keys to the rain. I mean, who?
RXR 101, the first release in the Round catalog, would be Robert Hunter's Tales of the Great Rum Runners, a tale we'll save for another day. From Grateful Dead and Round Records, please welcome back Andy Leonard.
Round Records was a scale model project, but as far as I was concerned, the music was just as real. When we produced Wake of the Flood and it worked, it's not like the coffers were full, because that had been done with a loan. What we did have at that point was confidence and inertia. So everybody that had one sort of corked up produced it. And we thought, we know how to do this. This is not that hard. We're not going to do 300,000 Hunter albums. Let's go. I mean, it wasn't that hard. There were smaller projects pinging right through there. The Grateful Dead would then go and do whatever they did to percolate the next one, which one never knew would be produced when.
What's this old world coming to? Things just ain't the same. Anytime the heart gets captured by the game.
If you're going to release a Ned Legend album, Sea Stones, or something that is cool, and that's why we made it, but you know that it's going to have a limited audience compared to a Grateful Dead record. When you call the distributors and you go, okay, here comes another one, it doesn't work as well if you say, I'm going to send you 40 copies, and I want you to do some advertising and go down and beat up the record store and see if you can get them in the front and for 40 copies. No. But if you go, okay, look, Round Records just coughed up 3 or 4 records and they're coming through and the volume on this is going to grow.
We're celebrating From the Mars Hotel, but its sibling albums, being sent into American reality almost simultaneously with the market force of the Grateful Dead, were Jerry Garcia's second solo album and Robert Hunter's Tales of the Great Rum Runners, all released in June 1974. We talked a bit about the recording of Jerry Garcia's solo album during our China Doll episode. Ron Rakow.
The cover of the first Garcia solo album put out on Round Records, it had a really good cover by Victor Moscoso. It was Jerry playing a guitar duplicated on like a sand dune or a desert. And there were just birds flying over his head. And it just said Garcia, one word, Garcia on the top. And then we put it out.
There was no proper title other than Garcia.
And then 20 years later, I'm doing something else, someplace else, and I read some major criticism about that album being called Garcia because there was a prior album put out by Warner Brothers called Garcia. I didn't care. George Foreman had 5 sons, and they named them all George. So what's the big deal?
But people do like names.
Compliments was a tag that went on this plastic that came off when you opened the record because we sent them out to the radio stations.
From Grateful Dead Records, Andy Leonard.
That was hysterical. We were still concerned about bootlegging at that point.
It was actually embossed in the cardboard. It was put on the demo DJ copies, the pre-release copies, to make sure that nobody would sell them. It was done after the album cover was complete, and it wasn't done to all of them, obviously. And I think, I'm not sure, but everybody just sort of decided that was cool.
A clever guy that worked for me had a moment of cleverness. His name was Steve Brown. He's the one that came up with compliments.
Big up, Steve Brown. Back to the letter that was sent out to Deadheads in 1974.
You gorillas are our gorillas, and we love you. But we only want you to do stuff if you dig it. Dig it. See ya, Anton Round.
So who was this Anton Round character? You may have already guessed the answer. Please welcome back Round Records co-owner Ron Rakow.
Well, the origin of Anton Round is my tuchus.
He also had a brother, Roland.
Roland A. I needed a character. Do you know what, in the sales game, what the words third-party influence means? A stranger who has nothing to do with the buy and sell between the salesman and the potential buyer, who gives an opinion that's favorable to the seller or the buyer, is a person that one can employ to offer third-party influence. He has no win or lose he has no dogs in the fight, but he's giving an opinion. That's third-party influence. Well, third-party influence is the most effective sales tool there is. After the free sample, I needed third-party influence. Who was I going to go to? And everybody that I would go to that would be credible had an axe to grind, and they wanted me gone so they could grind their axe. Well, so I had to come up with third-party influence, so I invented Anton Round. And I already had a company called Round Records. What the fuck? It's simple.
Robert Hunter was none too pleased with the arrival of Anton Round onto the scene. In 1988, he told Blair Jackson, "When we formed Round Records, Ron Rakow took the mailing list and sent out these horrible little promo postcards signed Anton Round. And I thought it was the sleaziest looking Hollywood bullshit you'd ever want to see. I was outraged at this. How dare you use this for commercial purposes? I was told that the list was now to be used for this sort of thing, and basically that the list had been taken over. I said, count me out." Ironically, the Anton Round postcard had not only been in promotion of Hunter's own album, but the beginning of some of the Grateful Dead's first direct mail efforts, often cited as a breakthrough piece of independent marketing.
You want to use it for crass business stuff. Yeah, that's true. I did. Right.
Anton Round took on a life of his own.
Round was the name of the company. Anton went with that really nicely. And I made up a story that Anton Round was a 93-year-old, retired, multi-trillionaire business guy, and he would find people that he felt were interesting to him, and mentor them. And in the past, he mentored Bill Graham, which is how he got to me, and Ray Kroc, who went on to found a McDonald's, and one other guy of that stature. 3 guys like that.
Oh, really?
I got sued or threatened to be sued by the estate of Ray Kroc. Mrs. Kroc got one of the mailings. Somebody in her family was a Grateful Dead head, and they got the Anton Round letter in the mailing for the new album release. So she turned it over to her law firm, and the law firm called me and said, if you don't, stop cease and desist, it's called a cease and desist letter, and further advertise that this was fake and recircularize everybody that got it, that it was fake. So I called them back and I said, hey, you're dealing with hippies. I don't think you know what that means, but I will stop doing it. And I'll write if you want, I'll write a letter of apology to Mrs. Kroc, and I won't do it anymore. But if you want me to recirculate anything or do anything like that, I have to send you a bill for how much it costs, because we don't have any money. We're lucky we can keep the door open. So they said, no, we're not coming up with any money. We'll be satisfied. You give us assurance that you're not going to do that again. Okay. That was the end of that.
I can find no paper trail, published or otherwise, in which Anton Round says he mentored Ray Kroc, but maybe it happened on another stub. I'll keep digging, though. There was a whole spectrum of marketing tactics thought up by Grateful Dead Records. Steve Brown.
I came up with ideas that we could use to promote the albums. When we did Mars Hotel, I came up with the Mars Hotel soap bars that you'd get in a hotel, the stuff that would be. But when you open it up, it would be like this black soap, that would be weird.
Steve Brown would end up becoming the public face of what turned out to be perhaps the most effective idea of all.
The best idea of all was the free stuff booth. That was the best idea that worked. The free stuff booth that I designed and Ramrod built, which was a table with the legs folded up inside it. And it said free stuff booth, the free stuff booth. Ramrod made it personally. It was really cool. And Steve Brown took it around. And when you folded it up, it was 4 feet high by 8 feet wide. And we signed people up to join our fan club. And the number of fan club members went from 13,000 to 20 months later, there were 93,000.
The free stuff booth was covered in vivid colors by master tie-dye artist Courtenay Pollack.
We did the promotion booth. They were 8 foot by 4 foot slabs of plywood. I put a frame around the 8 foot by 8 foot and basically made it so that they would fold into a suitcase, 8 foot by 4 foot rectangle. So I could actually pick up one in each hand and carry them to wherever we were setting them up.
Steve Brown.
It was a booth that was designed with big signs that said Grateful Dead commercial message, which I actually have still here in this house. And the tables that went in front were all hung with Courtenay tie-dyes in the front. And the 4 panels that were behind me and stuff were the seasons, also done by Courtenay tie-dye. Huge. These were like 4 foot by 6 foot panels. Really nice. Yeah, beautiful.
In the top squares, the 4 by 4 squares, which there were 4 of them, when the things were opened up and stood side by side, they created a 16 foot by 8 foot high booth. So the top half of the backs of each of these 8 by 4s. So there were 4. It was a 4 seasons mandalas, and I resined them into the back of the plywood. So they had that wet look. So they're really bright and brilliant color. And of course, it added a lot to the weight of the things, this massive resin. And we had all our free stuff folded into these cases. I picked these things up. They must have weighed close to 100 pounds a piece.
We knew that when we went to these concerts, that if we had a booth that would have people sign up to be on our mailing list, that we could get to them that way with what we were doing, where we're going to be playing, what the records are they're working on, when they're going to come out, and give them little postcards, flyers, or little pictures of the albums that had already been done or were being done.
One thing to emphasize is that it really was a free stuff booth. They weren't selling T-shirts or any kind of merchandise. Really just hanging out.
May 74, I think, is when went on the road and did our whole 1974 tours, including Europe and stuff.
In May of 1974, the Dead had hit Reno, now on the From the Mars Hotel 50th Anniversary Edition, and then performed a trio of shows in the Northwest, now on the Pacific Northwest 73-74 box set, all of which we discussed last time. They played outdoors in late May in Santa Barbara, followed by a massive day on the green at home in the Bay Area at Oakland Coliseum Stadium, alongside the Beach Boys and the New Riders of the Purple Sage. It was the only outdoor Bay Area show with the wall of sound.
If you want to drift back by the tie-dyes back there, there's an information booth, and you can stand in front of the information booth and stand there at home plate and get chills up and down your spine as you think this is the home plate where the world champion Oakland A's come to bat every afternoon when they're home.
I remember this one time, there was a stadium, and from where I entered to where we had to set them up was about 2 city blocks away around the stadium, and I had to walk these things around the passageways to this far remote corner where they'd come up for the concessions and food and drinks and stuff like that, and where I set this stuff up. And that was quite the labor of love, hauling those things around.
We always had this kind of thing at any kind of a trade show or something where there'd be a table and a booth and there'd be people handing out information and signing you up for their mailing list and stuff. So it wasn't a new idea as such, but at a rock and roll show where it was colorful and you had cool stuff to talk to and people to talk to, it was always kind of a special kind of a place for people to seek out. I always felt like it was a good idea that worked well. I always have to get some people to help and stuff, and these guys were Dead fans and stuff, and staying in a hotel somewhere, a motel somewhere, and they would take in the hotel, in the bathroom, one of the cloths that they give you, and they brought with them a thing that would, what do you call it? It's an iron-on type. Well, not even iron. It's a thing you can make the color go through anyway. Yeah, that's it.
Part of Steve's collection, which you can see in my book Heads, is the result of deadhead handiwork, burned onto a hotel hand towel of Baron Woolman's 1969 portrait of Garcia with his arms crossed, captioned, "Ignore alien orders." Steve's pad is truly a museum. When Rich and I visited, it blew both of our minds.
That box right there, it's a mirror box, actually, and it's got lights underneath glass in there. And that double skull you saw over there in the hallway that is done by David Best, that sat in there. And this was mounted on the front of those panels that were behind the table there at the booth. And when you lit that up, you look into there, and because there's mirrors shaped a certain way, it's an infinity box, so it's double skulls as far as you can see. Whoa. David Best is the same guy that does the temples at Burning Man and has done a lot of the art cars that you see racing around there over the years and stuff. He was one of the original guys to actually start doing that kind of thing up there, I guess with Larry Harvey and stuff.
Along with the piles of mail constantly pouring into the office, it was the most direct line of communication they'd built yet.
We had free stuff to hand out, which was great. You know, everybody loves free stuff. People would ask questions, and to the best of our ability, we'd answer them. I was able to jump from one subject to another, in my mercurial fashion, do our what we call promotion, which was essentially a goodwill thing out of that promotion booth. And it was quite effective.
It was really nice because they'd come up with things that had to do more or less with certain venues that they wanted them to play that they would mention, or places that they knew that the Dead should look at to go to and play. They would ask questions about the music and about the albums. They would want to know if there was a chance that they could get tickets for certain shows that were coming up and stuff, and just generally ask questions about the personal things of each of the band people. So you had to have people there to talk to, them in ways that would be friendly and nice. And the more we did that, the more it just started to feel like it was really a cultural thing that was happening, a societal kind of a grouping of folks that were becoming these serious deadheads.
The Wall of Sound hit the road for real in the middle of June, with a schedule intended to drop them from the Midwest down through the South, up the East Coast, and then back to the Midwest for the 4th of July and on homewards. As From the Mars Hotel was getting pressed up across the country, the tour leg opened on June 16th, back at the fairgrounds in Des Moines, where they'd played the previous May. The 73 show is on Here Comes Sunshine. The 74 appearance is on Road Trips, Volume 2, Number 3. At the Des Moines show, the Wall of Sound underwent its next evolution. Please welcome back journalist Brian Anderson, working on a book about the Wall of Sound to be titled Loud and Clear. We've posted a link at dead.net/deadcast.
I think the biggest changes as the Wall of Sound got rolling into the spring and summer of 1974 was really just the scale of the whole thing. They had worked out eliminating the intermodular distortion. For the most part, the feedback canceling microphones. They had figured out the staging and the scaffolding. And so from there on out, I think it just got bigger. Early 1974, those Winterland shows, the whole rig was on the order of 40 tons. But then by summer and by the end of the year, they were looking at 75 tons worth of gear. I've even heard secondhand that it was pushing like 80 tons worth of gear. So just a staggering amount of gear. And they had the woodworking and carpentry workflow by that point, I think, was pretty dialed in. So they could just like crank out the speakers. And yeah, they just kept growing that thing, especially considering the number of outdoor shows that took place that spring and summer.
There was one member of the Dead especially who encouraged them to push their technological envelope.
Lesh was just stoked on everything. Ever the like avant-garde student and audiophile searching for the perfect sound.
That was the sound of Phil Lesh playing Eyes of the World in Des Moines in June 1974. In Des Moines, Lesh followed Jerry Garcia into the realm of custom instruments, playing his new bass on stage for the first time. A 4-string quadraphonic alembic named Osiris by its creators, Rick Turner and George Mundy. These days, it's known as Mission Control, capable of far more than your average bass. Today, we're happy to have with us Jason Scheuner, a lifelong music professional with an interest in vintage Dead gear. A half-decade ago, Jason became the owner of Mission Control and knows as much about the inner workings of the instrument as anybody outside Phil Lesh and the bass's original creators.
Mission Control was built not for the Wall of Sound, but it was built as part of the Wall of Sound. And it was so far ahead of its time, and it was so expensive to build. It was built in 1973 and 1974. It took a little while to build it. But it cost, in 1973, it cost $35,000, which in today's money is almost $250,000. And apparently, Phil got a little bit of ribbing from some of the crew guys that his bass cost more than their homes.
His quadraphonic bass was essentially a part of the sound system in that he could throw individual strings to different clusters of his towering 32-foot tall stacks, 32 feet being the height of a standing bass wave. And I've had Dead insiders liken that effect to the iconic 5-note theme from Close Encounters, right? So boom, 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 in that the notes would sort of like ping pong around the venue. Very, very trippy stuff.
The Osiris Mission Control bass would be Lesh's main, though not exclusive, acts for the next 5 years. In 1981, Phil Lesh talked a bit about his experiments in quad with David Gans. Thanks, as always, to David for the audio. Check out a link to his work at dead.net/deadcast. Phil credits the idea of the quad pickup to one of his fellow bassists.
This was Jack Cassidy's idea to have a pickup for each string. And as far as I know, Jack never did it. But I have 2 instruments that have this. I even had a setup that was capable of using it for a while, especially in that big system, the big tall system, the rocket gantry systems, what they call them.
Something fascinating there is how Phil refers to the Dead's 1974 sound system, a continuous point of interest to me. We now call it the Wall of Sound, and there's a newspaper clip from that era that calls it that as well. But I think it took a while to catch on. In 1981, Phil Lesh doesn't use that phrase. He calls it the Big Tall System, that he compares to the support structure for rocket ships. In 1974, quadraphonic was the next big sonic dream. Stereo had really only become prominent in the music industry in the early 1960s. By the end of that decade, experiments in quad were happening in various scenes, which can be read as a technological counterpart to the immersive multimedia happenings that had become part of the arts worlds in the years after World War II. and often involve varieties of surround sound. The Dead would experiment with quad in various ways, including a performance on San Francisco television in 1970, where viewers were encouraged to create a quad effect in their homes by tuning into separate FM radio stations. In 1973, Pink Floyd had toured with their version of a quad sound system, and Jerry Garcia, Phil Lesh, and Owsley Stanley checked out their gig at Radio City Music Hall in March 1973.
Pink Floyd and a few other bands had played with quad sound, where they were using two left and right mains and then left and right mains in the back, and playing with spatial relationships within a room or a stadium or an arena or whatever it may be. I believe it was Phil that came up with the concept of actually making an instrument quad capable.
That was the sound of Phil Lesh's first quad bass in action. His modified Guild Starfire, known as Big Brown, deployed during the outro on the Wake of the Flood version of Eyes of the World. There are virtually no known photos of the From the Mars Hotel session from the spring of '74, but I'm guessing he plays it there as well. The new bass had a new name, which connected with both Phil Lesh's nudie suit and his appearance on the back cover of Mars Hotel.
On the back of the headstock is an inlay of Osiris, which is perfect because Osiris is the king of the dead. The original namesake of the bass is actually Osiris. When they built it, it was called Osiris. It was the Deadheads that came up with the term mission control, because what they saw was Phil would push a button on the bass or he would turn a knob on the bass and they would hear it affect the wall.
It has lots of different filters on it and the capability of switching from one kind of sound, like the same sound coming from all the speakers, to one string coming from each of half of them, each one of these stacks. So, in other words, each string from 4 different sets, so it bounces around.
If you've seen the Grateful Dead movie, in the scene where they focus on the bass and they talk about the functions of it, and then there's the whole funny part with the cameraman.
Hi. I'm not trying to do that on purpose. The camera. Yeah, bring it back, bring it back, bring it back. Come on, come on, come on. We can play together. Wait a minute. Yeah, we can.
One of the bass's chief architects is in the scene, too.
It's George Mundy that's sitting on the stage talking about the bass with the backs off, and you can see the guts inside.
Like most basses or guitars that you hear, have 1 or 2 good tones on them. This bass has many, many good tones and can simulate the sound of other basses.
It was about having as much variety as possible in your palette of tones from one instrument. Mission Control is the product of everything they learned from all the modifications of Big Brown and building it from scratch with all the information that they had learned. And so for Mission Control, the quad pickup, instead of being between the neck and bridge pickup, is a skinny pickup instead of a full-size pickup, and it's between the bridge pickup and the bridge. And Rick Turner explained to me that by placing it there, they were able to get much more distinct separation for each string. And it was much more articulate in the quad mode.
Okay.
The Osiris bass was a singular instrument, and so for the next 4 or 5 minutes, we're going to talk about knobs, also buttons, and some connectors. This section is for my buddy Bubba.
if you look at Big Brown and you look at Mission Control, you see that there are a ton of knobs. In fact, they're drawn to the number of knobs on the bass. And the truth is that the knobs are actually fairly simple. What you have is you have one knob that's a master volume. And then for each pickup, you have what they call a state variable filter. Alembic did a lot of development on the state variable filter. And they came up with basically a filter called the super filter. And the super filter has a master volume for the individual pickup, plus a blend of the filtered sound versus the unfiltered sound. Then there is the choice of a frequency, adjustable Q, so the width at which that frequency is affected, right there just at that frequency, or how many of the neighboring frequencies it would affect.
Getting a little carried away there.
And then there's also high pass, low pass, and band pass filter selection. So you have 5 knobs that are basically a state variable filter for each pickup. But those filters were so powerful that if he made an adjustment on the fly, you would hear it in the PA. And they put all of that stuff into the bass because Phil thought he would want the ability to make those adjustments on the fly while he was playing. And what they figured out was it was a bit of a distraction. So it became a set and forget kind of thing. And so only on a handful of recordings do you hear Phil making adjustments with the knobs. But when you do, it's pretty obvious. Any adjustment to those filters or any choice of outputs with the buttons on the front would have a drastic effect on the sound coming through the wall of sound.
All right, that covers the knobs. What about the buttons?
When you see all the buttons on Mission Control, all those white buttons, those were all preset outputs for mono, stereo, quad plus mono, quad plus stereo. Apparently there were like 16 different presets. And the reason that they had to build all of that into the bass itself, and the reason that they had to run the quad system the way they did in 1974 is because consoles were limited to 16 channels. The biggest console that basically you could build at that point to take 4 MX MX10 mixers, which the Grateful Dead used for years. Bear was a huge fan of those. And you could link 4 of them together and get a 16:2 mixer, which at the time was huge. But when you've got 16 channels for the Grateful Dead, it's not like you can devote 4 or 5 of them to Phil. These days, the way that the modern consoles and PA systems work, you would never have built all those presets into the bass, which cost an incredible fortune to do at that time. And you wouldn't necessarily spread things out to different individual arrays of speakers. What you would do now is to take the 4 quad channels and then also either the neck and bridge or a sum of the neck and bridge in mono and just pan them across the soundstage. You would use 5 or 6 inputs on the console, which these days consoles have 24, 32, 48, 56, huge numbers of inputs. So there's generally enough extra inputs where you could really do something cool with it. So it was not just ahead of its time, it was light years ahead of its time.
Naturally, a quad bass needed a whole output system of its own to even plug it in.
The output is actually an 18-pin Lemieux connector, and there's literally 18 pins worth of output. Now, we only use 10 of the 18 pins, but there's actually 10 functional outputs from the instrument, and the connectors that were used were actually built for the CERN laboratory over 50 years ago. And the aforementioned George Mundy, before he came to work at Alembic and then wound up working for the Grateful Dead, had actually worked for the CERN laboratory. So he was aware of these really complex connectors, and he actually sourced some of these connectors to use for the bass.
And from there?
You go from this 18-pin cable into a power supply box, and then the power supply box has outputs for the neck and bridge pickups at 1/4 inch, which can also be summed to mono. And then there are 4 1/4 inch outputs for the quad, 1 for each string, and they can also be summed to mono. So even the quad pickup you can listen to as a mono pickup. And so there's a lot of different output configurations that you can achieve, hence the 16 presets that were built into it originally.
As it turned out, maybe you didn't want to spread 4 bass strings across the whole speaker system. This is from David Gans's 1981 interview with Phil Lesh.
I used it maybe 2 or 3 times for about 2 minutes each, just during the period of the gantry system. When you're doing that, the band can't really comprehend. I mean, they can't work with it because they can only hear part of it because there's a delay. Of course, because it was 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. And it was real tall, 36 feet tall, I think. There's a delay, and the band can't work with it musically, so I just abandoned it. It was a great idea, and I still have the instruments. And with the right output jack and boxes, it works like a charm.
Though quad basses didn't become any more common than quadraphonic LPs, Phil Lesh's work with Rick Turner and George Mundy at Alembic had a profound influence on the next generations of electric basses.
And Rick Turner sort of rewrote the book on how to build instruments. And what he did was instead of using a bolt-on neck or one-piece necks, he would take different combinations of tone woods that were chosen for very specific reasons. And he would cut them into strips and glue them together and laminate these necks. And instead of the neck attaching at the body, the neck would go all the way through the body, where we get the term neck through. And then they would take also very specifically chosen combinations of tone woods and sandwich them together to make what they called the wings of the bass or the guitar. And then the laminated sandwiched wings would be glued on either side of the laminated neck through portion of the instrument, which is also the way that Wolf was built and the way alembics are still built today. And at that time, that was basically just unheard of. It just wasn't done. And as soon as it was done for Phil and Mission Control hit the stage in all these big venues, high-profile situations, it triggered a response from the rest of the music industry. And almost immediately, people like Stanley Clarke and McVie from Fleetwood Mac and Skeet Curtis from Parliament Funkadelic, which was a gigantic band at that time, and John Entwistle from The Who and John Paul Jones all gravitated toward this type of construction for their instruments and started getting instruments made at Alembic.
From there, the influence spread outwards.
When you look at all of these incredible instruments that were played by all these incredible musicians and bands starting in the mid-'70s, that's a direct result of what Rick Turner did and developed and how he built things at Alembic and how Alembic went about creating instruments. And Phil's influence on those instruments became sort of the new standard for boutique guitars and bass guitars. There are countless companies out there that are following the legacy and sort of the pioneering visionary attitude of somebody like Phil Lesh without having any clue where it actually all came from. People that are educated, they know. But there are a lot of people out there that that's just become the standard. And what it's referred to within the music industry, that construction technique is referred to as the hippie sandwich, because it was obviously the hippies, the folks at Alembic that did this first, and the fact that they are literally sandwiching these layers of wood together, it became known as the hippie sandwich.
That's an expensive sandwich. But 1974 was the peak of the Grateful Dead's imperial period, a more literal phrase than most when applied to them. Along with their music itself, they were pushing at the boundaries of live sound, recorded sound, the instruments used to generate both, and the economic and physical means by which it was distributed. For about 2 years, the Grateful Dead were as independent as it's possible to be for any American artist in any creative field, let alone operating on a national scale. And, with one Grateful Dead album released, one coming, and the impending launch of Round Records, at least one person was thinking about how to push it to still the next level. Ron Rakow.
The record company came with the most major capital base extant, the First National Bank of Boston. It took me years to figure out why they took us on. I mean, that's a really, really staid bank. It was, at the time, a $20 billion bank. That's still not a small bank.
The story begins like lots of Cadillac Ron stories, with a hyper-specific memory.
I know that I was in room 1234 at the Sheraton Hotel on Boylston Street in Boston.
It was September 1972, and the Dead were at the Boston Music Hall.
So I call up the First National Bank of Boston, and I say, I'm with an orchestra. We happen to be playing in town, and I'd like to come in and discuss with you doing factoring for we're going to issue our own records, and I'd like to talk to you about it. And he said, what is the name of this orchestra? I said, the Grateful Dead. He said, really? I said, yeah. He said, okay, hold on a second. I'm going to give you one of my people. So I get this guy, his name was Jim Dollar, of all things. It turns out he's the guy at the First National Bank that's in charge of weirdness. Something is too weird for everybody else, it goes to Jim Dollar.
That was his real name, James Dollard, with a D at the end. By August 1973, Rakow was in Dollard's office, making proposals.
Every time I went back east, I went into that bank and I made friends with everybody, cross departments, everybody. And so I got the Grateful Dead to become the hottest item inside that bank. That was one of my big priorities.
A 1974 Wall Street Journal piece was titled, "The Image is Hippie, but the Grateful Dead also know business." It quoted Jim Dollard as saying, "Frankly, I was very skeptical at first, but I was much impressed with Ron Rakow and his research." Dollard said that working with the Dead was one of the most interesting relationships I've had in this business.
And then I come up with an idea, and I hit Dollar with it, Jim Dollar, and I say, look, we're going to be in town for 3-4 days. The next time we come to town, why don't we have Jerry and me come for lunch? He said, and meet the head of the bank. He said, we have our own lunchroom for that. Our dining room is on the 12th floor. And we went in. I had a good solid 9 months of action with those guys before we had this lunch. June 74 was when we had our lunch. They were at Boston Garden. We were staying at a hotel in Cambridge.
That was Phil Lesh playing Loose Lucy on Mission Control from the same week that From the Mars Hotel hit stores, The Dead at the Boston Garden, June 28, 1974, now on Dick's Picks 12.
I asked Jim to arrange, I'm not going to bring Jerry in just to meet with ordinary people. I want the senior executives of the holding company, not just your division, but the bank, the whole bank. He said, oh no, don't worry about it. If we do this, it'll be royalty. He'll be royalty. around the private dining room, there were 2 or 3 liveried waiters with, tuxedo pants, a white shirt with a white vest, and a white bow tie. And they're serving us. And we have a before lunch cocktail, and we're all mingling. Oh, and we didn't drink, and they didn't allow alcohol. So we all had clamatos. Jerry comes over to me. I separated from him at this thing. That's the way you do it when you're, trying to get known by a bank. You don't clot with people you know. You clot with people you don't know. That's the purpose for being there. Anyway, so Jerry comes over to me during the course of this pre-lunch thing, and he whispers in my ear, "Back up the truck. This is backstage," and walked away. And I know what that means. Okay, so we sit down, and the seating is amazing. The chairman of the board sat at the head of the table alone. He's the senior guy. On his left was the president of the First National Bank of Boston, the bank. And then next to him was the president of the factoring division that we used. And then it went down the line. It was totally hierarchical. On his right was Jerry, and then there were those officers of various divisions all down the line from her. And there must have been, 12, 13, 14 people in the room. When we finally sit down to have lunch, everybody is silent. He says, "Jerry, my daughter, we do the banking for the Berklee School of Music." This is how he started. "We do the banking for the Berklee School of Music. And my daughter came to me, and she wants to play the clarinet." So I called the president of the Berklee School of Music, and I told him what she wanted. And he said, "Start her on the violin." So Jerry laughed. He didn't laugh. He cackled. He had a cackle. You see it he had this cackle. He said, "I'm a father. When my kids ask me for something that they want to do, I don't change the dot on an I or the line on the T. I give them exactly what they say they want. So if they say they're going to quit, I remind them they ask for exactly what they got." So the guy, the banker guy said, "That's really a good idea." He said, "If somebody gave me a clarinet when I wanted to play the guitar, I would probably be in another business now." That's really wise. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do exactly what you said. Then the next guy, the president of the bank, the First National Bank of Boston president, says, "Jerry, I'm building an entertainment studio in my house, and we do the banking for EPI speakers. Do you think that's good enough for a top-flight entertainment?" So Jerry leans over and says, "Hey, Rack, what's the name of that company we trade records for speakers with?" I said, "EPI." So Jerry said, "I have them in my house. They're great. We trade records for them for speakers." So the guy, he swells up. He swells up. You can see it. And then the guy said, "Well, they want me to buy EPI 50s. So Jerry said, "Rack, what's the ones I have in my house?" So I said, "They're EPI 50s, Jerry." So he says to the guy, "That's exactly what I have in my home." And I swear to God, I thought the guy was going to explode. He was going to have the same speakers as Jerry Garcia that he has in his own house. And the whole lunch went like that. I was just hanging out with the other guys. Yeah. Thank you. lunch goes like that, and the lunch is breaking up, and Jim Dollar comes up to me and whispers to me, he said, everybody's expecting you to ask for something. You have to make an ask. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, we're a bank. We lend money. Ask for something. So I said, okay, tell them I want a $2.5 million line, no financial disclosures, no nothing, just on our signature, period. We'll sign a note, and if I need money, I'll call you, and you'll put whatever I ask for, up to $2.5 million, into our bank account. He said, well, that's really an easy ask. I can do that on my own limits. So it wasn't even really a big deal, but he had something to say to them. And it was in the right neighborhood. It was in the millions. So, and then it became obvious we were in a spot where we could do a lot of stuff. So they knew that we were not stupid and we were on a fast track. Jim Dollar told me, he said, you guys are limited by your own imagination. We are going to fund you guys no matter what it takes. We get into a limo to get back to our hotel, and I say, you know, we're there, Jerry. We can make the big mistake now. You know, we can flame out. You know, I mean, this could be. And he said to me, don't lose confidence. There's nothing you can do that can affect anything that I consider important in my life, win or lose. Nothing. What does that mean? He said, can you make me play better? I said, don't be ridiculous. No. Can you make me play worse? No. He said, that's all I care about.
Round and round and round and round, round and round. Don't take much, get me on the ground. Smile, but I ain't your type. Don't shake the tree when the fruit is ripe. Yeah, 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 yeah.
The big part of it is they had a problem and we were the solution. I knew nothing about this problem for several years after this happened. And their problem was this. They had a big bank with $20 billion of other people's money, and they had to invest that money and make the spread between what they paid the people who invested the money in their bank and what they got for investing the money, right? That's banking, right? It costs to have people sufficiently trained to be able to authorize lines of credit. Like Jim Dollar, I didn't know this, had a $4 million line of authority to lend $4 million without speaking to anybody. That took years. Their big problem was to get somebody to have a $25,000 line of credit usually involved between $200,000 and $300,000 in training expenses. And what would happen once they got somebody up to that level, they would quit because the bank was boring, staid. Nobody young wanted to be associated with that bank. And all of a sudden, they come up with the hippest band in the United States, the Grateful Dead. And they're flooded with applications from graduates of every major school in the United States. Flooded. That's why they did it.
Well, if you can't be part of the problem, be part of the solution. Am I right? In the early summer of 1974, at virtually the same moment that Garcia and Rakow were making friends at the Bank of Boston, teenage Lee Ranaldo, 7 years from co-founding Sonic Youth, was getting ready to go on the road himself.
Mars Hotel came out early summer 74, right when I was graduating high school, I want to say. And that was a pretty momentous summer for me. My one of the same buddies that I went to Watkins Glen with and I took a summer-long post-high school, pre-college trip across the country. So we did a huge, massive circle around the United States. We hit the West Coast up in Seattle and drove the coast road all the way down to San Diego with heavy stops in San Francisco in particular and Los Angeles.
Lee's story is a great reminder of how From the Mars Hotel functioned when it came out.
Mars Hotel was kind of the soundtrack of that trip. We had my old Volkswagen Bug that we had painted California or Bust on the back with a steely face underneath it on the trunk.
We've heard about David Lemieux's experience listening to From the Mars Hotel on a cassette stuck in the car tape deck. And we've heard about Nick Paumgarten's experiencing it on its first CD release in the mid-1980s. Lee Ranaldo had still another.
And we had an 8-track player, one of those aftermarket 8-track players that you installed underneath the dashboard with a couple screws and wires. And we had a bunch of music, but Mars Hotel was really the main record of that summer. We played it to death.
Red and white, blue suede shoes. I'm Uncle Sam. How do you do?
Man, we rocked that record all the way across the country and back, and it meant a lot. It just seemed like such a bright record after Wake of the Flood, but it just seemed like such a bright, summery record and full of life to it.
There's a reason why Lee and his buddy may have gotten that vibe off the album.
We had the 8-track tape of it, so I think there was a period when I didn't really know the correct order of the songs on that record because of the way that 8-track mixed up the order sometimes to make the sides even lengths. I was looking at the track list this morning, and I was surprised to see China Doll in the second position. It wasn't my memory of it coming that early in the sequence, and maybe that's from listening to the 8-track.
Pretty much. On the 8-track, China Doll is moved to the end of the album, just before Ship of Fools. In the second slot is Phil Lesh and Bobby Peterson's Pride of Cucamonga.
Whoa, oh, pride of Cucamonga. Whoa, oh, better olives in the sun. Whoa, oh, I had me some loving in a dumb song time.
And I have to say, though I understand why they'd want to space out the two slow songs on the album, moving Pride of Cucamonga up and China Doll down really does give it a summertime glow. Either way, the car was equipped.
We had been doing a little weed dealing in high school, and we brought like half a pound of weed with us on that trip, like stuffed into the side panels of the VW. And we had this funny pipe that someone gave us as a parting gift that was it suction cupped onto the dashboard, and it had two long plastic tubes coming off it, so that we could kind of both be hitting off it at once, which was kind of funny. The Haight was the first place we went. So we went and hung around in the Haight. And I think we strolled by 710, which, I seem to find myself strolling past it almost every time I'm in San Francisco with a little time to kill. We went to some all-night hippie party in Marin County where all the cars, I don't know how we found out about it. I think some girl in San Francisco had told us about it, and we drove up there. And you parked your cars up on this bluff, and you had to kind of climb down in the dark through this ridge to the beach where the party was. And when we got back to the car in the morning, the car had been broken into, and a bunch of kind of minor stuff had been stolen. And they tried to rip the tape player out of the car and could not get it free of its screws or whatever. It was like we found the tape player like hanging off the bottom of the dashboard, like it had been tried to be wrenched out of there, but they didn't make it. And they stole a bunch of the 8-tracks, but the Mars Hotel was not stolen. And so I think for the second half of that trip, it was one of the very few 8-tracks we had in the car. So we really just like played the hell out of it. And we thought it was kind of a miracle that it being the favorite of those 8 tracks that we had along with us, that it was the one that got left behind, and that the tape player didn't get stolen.
The dual pipe did not survive the trip.
We were making time going north out of Santa Barbara and had the stereo thing in full effect, and the cops were going by us in the other direction. We were, both going like 60 miles an hour, and like a minute later, they're behind us with their lights flashing, and we're like, oh shit. We were stopped just outside of Santa Barbara by the CHIPS, the LA Highway Patrol, and they really got a kick out of us discovering that pipe. They were calling it a stereo model, which was kind of funny. Well, actually, at that point, we were down to like the last ounce of weed, and they were really playing. They were like 2 cops, one being the friendly guy and one being the total asshole, and they were like, we're going to search your car, and if we find anything, you're going to go to jail and all this stuff. But if you give it to us, you'll get off easier. So we actually turned over our weed to them and watched them dump it out into the wind on the Pacific Coast Highway there, and they took the pipe and split. So they let us off.
So I think I'll drift home where it's at, where the weed grows green and fine, and wrap myself around a bush of that bright, whoa, waka.
Ironically, as Lee and his friend hit the West Coast, the Dead were traversing the East, and they managed to miss each other. But he'd certainly catch them again, though it might not have been until 1976. By then, Loose Lucy was gone from the repertoire and stayed on the shelf for the next decade and a half. Listener William Cunningham left us this story about when he caught the Dead at the Cap Center in Maryland in March 1990.
We were in college. I was about 19 years old. We used to talk on the way to the show about songs that we really wanted to hear. And for some reason, I kept talking about how the song I really wanted to hear was Loose Lucy. Now, we were too early in our Dead experience to realize that they hadn't played Loose Lucy since about 1974, so there's pretty much zero chance that we were going to get to see it. But then, lo and behold, midway through the first set, they bust out slow version of Loose Lucy.
Loose Lucy is my delight.
And Jerry Garcia, in all the 100+ shows I saw, I've never seen him grin the way he grinned when he started playing that Loose Lucy. And I'm sure everybody who was there can remember, he just looked like he was having the time of his life.
Grateful Dead archivist David Lemieux.
There weren't that many songs in the canon that changed so much. They Love Each Other, of course, went from really fast to really slow. Friend of the Devil. Loose Lucy had a pretty dramatic transformation. The 1973 arrangement, the bluesy arrangement, the 1974 arrangement of Loose Lucy. I'm a little bit more partial to this one, to the faster one, because it's a little different from anything else.
To summarize, it was up-tempo in early 1973, slowed down in later 1973, then sped up even faster at the album sessions in 1974, which we just heard. Like I said before, I'm not exactly sure the reason for any of these, but it underlined that it was an easy song to adjust to the Dead's needs. If they needed a faster or slower tune to go in the set lists, or for an album at that particular moment, they could just readjust Loose Lucy.
When they brought it back in 1990, it was almost like a hybrid of the two. At least early on, it kind of became more of the slower 1973 arrangement.
was from Nassau Coliseum, March 28, 1990, also on the spring 1990 box. It wasn't so much that the tempo was that different in the 90s, but that they straightened out the groove with a firmer backbeat. Here it is from Albany, March 27, 1993, on the 30 Trips Around the Sun box. We've spoken in the past about how Dead songs could accrue new meanings over time, separate from how Robert Hunter might have intended them. He's Gone was written in early 1972, an epistle from Robert Hunter about being robbed blind.
Like I told you what I said, steal your face right off your head.
It might be seen as a takeaway lesson from the wall of sound that just because the audience can perfectly hear every syllable to a song and nuance of how they're delivered, it doesn't mean that Robert Hunter's lyrical intent would become the final word in how a song was received. The great novelist William Gibson once said, "The street finds its own uses for things," and he could be talking about how Grateful Dead fans interpret lyrics. There are some pretty clear places about where Robert Hunter's lyrics have communicated and maintained their intent unambiguously over decades, a point he made neatly to Amir Bar-Lev in Long Strange Trip.
Shall we go, you and I, while we can, through the transcendental night full of diamonds? What is unclear about that?
And perhaps there's nothing unclear about Loose Lucy either. But whether it is or isn't maybe isn't the point, which is never quite where you arrive at anyway, except that Deadhead seem to have very quickly found their own use for the chorus. This is from the audience tape of March 28, 1990 at Nassau Coliseum on Long Island, less than 2 weeks after the song's return, a demonstration of the chorus's power to put the title character into the background. This might be obvious, and conversely, I don't think it's controversial to point out that the crowd isn't singing to Loose Lucy. They're singing back to the Dead. Grateful Dead scholar Rev Carr wrote about moments like this in his wonderful chapter, Where All the Pages Are My Days, Metacantric Moments in Deadhead Lyrical Experience, published in the collection The Grateful Dead in Concert, which we've linked to at dead.net/deadcast. In it, he uses the phrase metacantric to describe the moments in Dead songs when the lyrics seem to be describing what Deadheads were experiencing when they heard them live, in a room filled with other Deadheads. But Loose Lucy is a metacantric moment where the context of the song's performance disappears the rest of the lyric and changes the meaning, pulling out the chorus as if it were a hit single separated from the rest of the album. It's no longer about the foibles of sleeping around, but the joy of the communal Dead experience. It's not exactly fair to call Loose Lucy an example of mission creep, because the Grateful Dead were certainly an open-ended project. But Loose Lucy is maybe one marker of how the meaning of the Grateful Dead as a whole shifted, from the acid tests through the next decades and on into the 21st century, for both the band members and the people listening to their music. Grateful Dead archivist David Lemieux.
I know that to me, it was our song. I remember I saw them play it a lot from 90 onward. Always a thrill to see it live because it had been gone for 16 years. I saw a good one in Buffalo later on, a really good one in Buffalo. I found it was one of those songs where, kind of like US Blues, it was the ending where Jerry would keep bringing the yeah, thank you for a real good time, bring it higher and higher. And when Jerry's voice did that Jerry voice cracking thing, it was because he was singing so hard with so much joy.
Singing, yeah, 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 yeah. Thank you. For a real good time.
My mom would be like, "Oh, was it a good show?" I'm like, "Yeah, it was a great show." Jerry's voice cracked during Loose Lucy. Like, that's what showed that the band was 100% into it. It was always one of those songs that was extremely welcome, and partly, mainly because it's a great song, but also it's the rarity of it, both in terms of the time I was seeing the Dead, but also in terms of the fact they hadn't played it in 16 years. So it was one of those songs that had a bit of a cachet around it that not all songs had.
Robert Hunter was reticent about putting his lyrics onto paper at first, preferring to let Deadheads have their own interpretations. Some editions of Live Dead included a beautifully illustrated lyric book, and Blues for Allah had the words too. But Loose Lucy demonstrated that it didn't actually matter if the lyrics were right or not. They meant what they meant, and that's all that they meant.
Yeah, singing, yeah, 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 yeah. Singing, yeah, 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 yeah. Singing, thank you for a real good time.
Thank you for a real good time indeed. A few years back, I went into the studio with some friends and we cut a version of Loose Lucy for the Dead Covers Project right here in Nashville. We got it in one take, we added some overdub background vocals, and I think it turned out pretty cool if I do say so myself. We posted a link over at dead.net/deadcast with the other links for this episode. Check it out. Thanks very much for tuning in to the good old Grateful Deadcast, friends. We'd like to thank our guests in this episode, Ron Rakow, Lee Ranaldo, Andy Leonard, Steve Brown, Courtenay Pollack, David Lemieux, Nick Paumgarten, Brian Kehew, Jason Scheuner, Brian Anderson, and William Cunningham. Extra special thanks to friend of the Deadcast, David Gans, for his ongoing contributions of audio from his interview archive. Executive producer for the good old Grateful Deadcast, Mark Pincus. Produced for Rhino Entertainment by Rich Mahan Promotions and Jesse Jarno. Special thanks to David Lemieux, Brian Dodd, and Doran Tyson. All rights reserved.